Dress had cost more than Sadia Lorenz should have spent, but she had bought it anyway because birthdays only come once, and turning 40 felt like it should mean something. She had imagined wearing it to dinner at the restaurant Gary had promised to book, the one overlooking the harbour where they'd had their first anniversary celebration back when he still looked at her like she mattered. The dress hugged her curves in ways that made her feel beautiful, despite the voices in her head that whispered about gravity and time. And she'd paired it with the diamond earrings her grandmother had left her, the ones that caught light and threw it back like tiny declarations of worth. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter from the cake she'd baked that morning, a 3-layer masterpiece with cream cheese frosting that had taken her 4 hours to perfect. 40 candles stood waiting in neat rows across the top, ready to be lit for a wish she hadn't quite formed yet. The dining table was set for 2 with the good china, the kind they only used for special occasions that had become increasingly rare over the past few years. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase, white roses, because Gary used to say they reminded him of her grace, back when he noticed things like grace instead of just flaws. Sadia heard the front door open and arranged her face into a smile, the kind that had become second nature after years of pretending everything was fine. She turned toward the hallway, expecting to see her husband alone, maybe carrying flowers or a gift wrapped in expensive paper. But instead, Gary walked in with his secretary trailing behind him like a shadow made of ambition and cheap perfume. Ember wore a dress too tight for professionalism and heels too high for someone who claimed to be there for work, her blonde hair cascading down her back in waves that looked expensive, but Sadia knew came from extensions. "I didn't realize we were having company," Sadia said, her voice steady even as something cold settled in her stomach. She'd met Amber before at office parties where the young woman had looked through her like she was furniture. Had heard Gary mention her name too often in conversations that didn't require it. Gary didn't answer right away. He walked past the dining table without glancing at the china or the flowers, moved past the cake with its waiting candles like they were invisible, and stopped in front of the kitchen counter where he dropped a manila envelope with enough force to make the sound echo. Amber stood near the doorway, wearing an expression that tried for sympathy but landed somewhere closer to satisfaction. Her glossed lips curved in a smile that made Sadia's hands curl into fists. "Open it," Gary said, and his voice had that tone he used in business meetings when he wanted people to know he was in charge, that flat authority that left no room for questions or negotiation. Sadia looked at the envelope and understood before she touched it, understood from the way Gary stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, understood from the way Amber's smile grew wider, like she was watching her favorite scene in a movie she'd already seen. The paper felt heavy in her hands when she pulled out the documents, and the words at the top swam into focus slowly. Petition for dissolution of marriage. "You're too old for me, Sadia," Gary said, and he spoke the words like he was stating a fact instead of destroying a life. "I need someone who still has energy, someone who can keep up with my lifestyle, someone who hasn't already lived half their life." The candles on the cake seemed to mock her with stillness, 40 little soldiers standing at attention for a celebration that would never happen. Sadia's grandmother's earrings felt heavy suddenly, weighted with all the generations of women who had survived worse than this, who had endured and rebuilt and refused to break. She set the papers down on the counter next to the envelope and looked at her husband of 15 years, really looked at him and saw a stranger wearing familiar clothes. "Is that all?" she asked, and her voice came out calmer than she expected, steadier than the ground felt beneath her feet. Gary's eyebrows rose, like he hadn't anticipated this response, like he'd been prepared for tears or begging or some dramatic scene he could use later to justify his choices to friends who would ask. "There's a pen in the envelope," he said, gesturing toward it with the impatience of someone who had somewhere better to be. "Sign everything and we can keep this simple. The prenup covers most of it anyway. You'll get what we agreed on when we got married, and we can both move forward." Amber shifted her weight from one high heel to the other, her eyes darting between them like she was watching a tennis match. "Gary, maybe we should give her some time to process this." "Aye," she said, but her tone suggested she'd rather do anything but wait, that she was eager to move into the next phase of whatever plan they'd constructed together. "She doesn't need time," Gary said, and he looked at Sadia with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with so much impatience. "She's a smart woman. She understands how these things work." Sadia pulled the pen from the envelope, a heavy silver thing that probably cost more than it needed to, and flipped through the pages without reading them. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, signing her name on every line, marked with a small yellow tab, watching the letters form in her own handwriting like they belonged to someone else. The pen scratched across paper with sounds that filled the quiet kitchen, each signature a small death of something that had already been dying for years. "Excellent," Gary said when she'd finished, gathering the papers with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "I'll have my lawyer file these tomorrow. You can stay in the apartment until the end of the month while you figure out where you're going. That should give you plenty of time to pack." Sadia set the pen down carefully, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the counter, and looked up at her husband with a smile that felt like it was happening on someone else's face. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in ways he couldn't possibly understand. "Thank you for the gift." Gary laughed, a sharp bark of sound that held genuine amusement mixed with disbelief. "A gift? Jesus, Sadia, you really are losing it." He turned to Amber and shook his head like he was sharing an inside joke. "See what I mean? Already acting like a confused old woman." Amber giggled, a high-pitched sound that scraped against Sadia's nerves, and linked her arm through Gary's with the possessiveness of someone staking a claim. "We should go," she said, looking up at him with doe eyes that had probably practiced that exact expression in mirrors. "We have dinner reservations, remember?" They walked toward the door together, Amber's heels clicking against the hardwood floor, Gary's hand settling on her lower back with casual ownership. At the threshold, he turned back to look at Sadia one more time, and she wondered if he was searching for some crack in her composure, some sign that she was breaking beneath the surface. "Happy birthday, by the way," he said, and the words were so absurd in their cruelty that Sadia almost laughed. "40 looks good on you, really." The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, and Sadia stood in her kitchen wearing her red dress with 40 unlit candles, bearing witness to the end of everything she'd thought she knew. She walked to the window and watched Gary's car pull out of the parking garage below, watched it disappear into traffic that would carry him toward whatever restaurant he'd chosen to celebrate his freedom with the woman who'd helped him plan this execution. Then Sadia went to her purse and pulled out the letter that had arrived from London 2 weeks earlier. The one from a law firm with a name that sounded old and established. The one that had informed her of Aunt Helena's passing and requested her presence at the reading of the will. Her aunt, who had never married and had built an empire in real estate across Europe, who had always called Sadia the only one in the family worth a damn, who had promised her once during a visit that family wasn't about blood, but about recognizing kindred spirits. The reading was scheduled for 8 days from now, and Sadia had already booked her flight because Aunt Helena deserved that respect, deserved to be mourned properly by the one person who had truly loved her. She hadn't told Gary about the death or the trip because he'd stopped asking about her life months ago, stopped caring about anything that didn't directly impact his own comfort or convenience. Sadia folded the letter carefully and put it back in her purse, then looked at the cake with its 40 candles and the divorce papers on the counter, with her fresh signatures still drying. She thought about Gary's face when he'd called her too old, about the way he'd laughed when she'd thanked him for the gift, about how certain he'd been that he was walking away the victor in this particular war. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Aunt Helena's estate was worth more than Gary had made in his entire life. more than he could probably comprehend in his shallow understanding of value and worth. The preliminary letter had mentioned properties and investments and numbers that Sadia was still trying to process. But the lawyer had been clear that everything, absolutely everything, was being left to her. Sadia picked up one of the candles from the cake and lit it with the kitchen lighter, watching the flame catch and hold steady despite the air conditioning that cycled through the apartment. She held it for a moment, this tiny light in the growing darkness, and made a wish that had nothing to do with reconciliation or forgiveness. Then she blew it out and began to plan. Chapter 2. The Perfect Performance. Sadia woke the morning after her birthday with clarity she hadn't felt in years. Like someone had wiped fog from a window she'd forgotten was dirty. She packed her belongings methodically, taking only what truly belonged to her and leaving behind everything Gary had purchased with his money and his judgment about what suited her. The designer handbags he'd chosen because he liked how they looked on his wife. The jewelry he'd bought for anniversaries when guilt made him generous. The furniture he'd selected without asking her opinion. All of it stayed behind like artifacts from a life that no longer fit. Her new apartment sat in a neighborhood Gary would have dismissed as ordinary, full of families and small shops and people who worked regular jobs instead of playing golf on Thursdays. The space was smaller than what she'd left, but the windows faced east and filled the rooms with morning light that felt like permission to start fresh. She arranged her grandmother's things with care, the photographs and quilts and recipe books that connected her to women who had survived their own wars and emerged with dignity intact. Nina arrived that evening with wine and Chinese takeout and the kind of friendship that didn't require explanations or apologies. They sat on Sadia's new couch, eating from containers and drinking from mismatched glasses, and Nina listened to the entire story without interrupting once. When Sadia finished, Nina poured them both more wine and said the thing that had been circling in Sadia's mind since she'd signed those papers. "So when are you telling him about the inheritance?" Nina asked, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. "I'm not," Sadia said, and the words felt powerful in her mouth. "Why would I tell him anything? He made it clear I don't matter anymore. He can believe whatever story makes him feel justified." Nina raised her glass in a toast. "To being underestimated," she said, and they drank to the idea that sometimes people's blindness was the greatest gift they could give. The next morning brought Barbara to Sadia's door, carrying a casserole in a glass dish covered with aluminum foil. Gary's mother wore her country club clothes and her country club smile, the one that said she was doing charity work by acknowledging lesser people. She swept into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, her eyes cataloguing every detail with the efficiency of someone trained to judge and dismiss in equal measure. "I wanted to check on you," Barbara said, setting the casserole on the kitchen counter like she was placing a crown. "Make sure you were handling everything appropriately. Divorce can be so difficult for women of a certain age." Sadia put the kettle on for tea and gestured toward the small dining table where Barbara settled herself with the air of a queen granting audience. She watched Sadia move through the kitchen, and something in her expression suggested she was pleased with what she saw, with the modest apartment and simple furniture that confirmed her assumptions about who would land on top. "Gary deserves to be happy," Barbara continued, accepting the tea Sadia offered with a nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement. "He's worked so hard to build his life, and he needs a partner who can appreciate what he's accomplished. Someone who still has the energy to support his ambitions." Sadia sipped her own tea and let Barbara talk. Let her explain all the ways Gary was the victim in this situation and how mature women understood when it was time to step aside gracefully. She nodded in the right places and made sympathetic sounds that cost her nothing, watching Barbara relax into the narrative where Sadia was the sad, aging ex-wife who would fade quietly into irrelevance. "The family is planning an engagement party for Gary and Amber," Barbara said, and her voice held the faintest edge of cruelty disguised as concern. "Next month at the club. I hope you understand that it wouldn't be appropriate for you to attend. Fresh starts require clean breaks." "Of course," Sadia said, and she meant it because she had no interest in watching Gary parade his replacement around people who measured worth in membership dues. "I hope it's everything he wants." Barbara left 20 minutes later, satisfied that she'd done her maternal duty, and confirmed that Sadia knew her place in the new hierarchy. Sadia watched her drive away in her luxury sedan, and then threw the casserole in the trash, because accepting food from people who fed you poison, disguised as comfort, was a mistake she wouldn't make again. Gary's father called that afternoon, his voice carrying authority. He'd spent a lifetime cultivating in boardrooms and country clubs. He didn't ask how she was doing or whether she needed anything, just launched into a speech about not making difficulties, about the prenuptial agreement being legally binding and not worth challenging. "I hope you understand that fighting this would only embarrass yourself," he said, and Sadia could picture him in his home office surrounded by expensive things that proved his worth. Gary was more than generous in the settlement. "You'll have enough to live comfortably if you're sensible about it." "I have no intention of causing problems," Sadia assured him, and she heard his exhale of relief through the phone line. "Gary's free to do whatever makes him happy. I've already moved on." Good, he said, and his tone warmed fractionally like she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "That's very mature of you. Barbara was worried you might become difficult, but I told her you were always a reasonable woman." Sadia ended the call and stood at her window, watching the neighborhood come alive with evening routines. Families gathering for dinner, and couples walking dogs, and ordinary people living ordinary lives. She thought about the lawyer waiting in London with documents that would change everything, about the empire Aunt Helena had built brick by brick without needing anyone's permission. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nina asking if she'd survived Barbara's visit, and Sadia smiled as she typed her response. She included a photo of the casserole sitting in her trash can, and Nina sent back 3 laughing emojis, followed by a message that said she was proud of Sadia's commitment to proper waste disposal. That night, Sadia pulled out her laptop and began researching lawyers. Not the kind who handled simple divorces, but the kind who destroyed people legally when those people deserved destruction. She found names that appeared in articles about high-profile cases, attorneys who had reputations for being ruthless and expensive and absolutely worth every dollar. She made a list and checked reviews and read profiles until she found exactly what she needed. His name was Harrison Wright, and his specialty was finding hidden assets and making sure people got exactly what they deserved rather than what their ex-spouses wanted them to have. His fees were astronomical, but Sadia smiled as she drafted an email requesting a consultation because soon money would be the least of her concerns. She explained her situation briefly, mentioned that she had resources but wanted to understand her options, and hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came within an hour, which told her that Harrison Wright ran his practice with efficiency she appreciated. His assistant scheduled a video call for 2 days later, and Sadia marked it in her calendar with satisfaction that felt warm in her chest. She spent the next day cleaning her apartment and unpacking boxes, creating a space that felt like hers instead of like a compromise between what she wanted and what someone else would tolerate. She hung her grandmother's quilts on the walls and arranged her books on shelves and planted herbs in pots on the kitchen windowsill. Nina stopped by in the afternoon with sandwiches and gossip about mutual friends who were already asking questions. "Stephanie wants to know if you're okay," Nina said, referring to a woman from their book club. "She heard from someone who heard from Barbara that you took the divorce really hard and moved into a tiny apartment because you couldn't afford anything better." Sadia laughed, genuine amusement bubbling up from somewhere deep. "Let her think whatever she wants," she said. "The truth will be so much better than anything they're imagining." Nina stayed for hours, and they talked about everything except Gary, until the conversation naturally circled back to him. Sadia told her about Gary's father's call and Barbara's visit, and Nina's expression shifted through disgust and anger before landing on determination. "When you're ready to burn it all down," Nina said. "I want a front row seat." "Oh, you'll get one," Sadia promised. And they clinked their wine glasses together. The video call with Harrison Wright exceeded every expectation. He listened without expression, taking notes on a legal pad, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her through the screen with eyes that missed nothing. "The prenup your husband had you sign was designed to leave you with almost nothing," he said. "But prenuptial agreements can be challenged and invalidated if certain conditions are met. I'd need to review the document and your financial records, but I suspect your husband made mistakes we can exploit." Sadia felt hope flare bright and hot. "What kind of mistakes?" Harrison's smile was the kind that probably terrified opposing counsel. The kind men make when they're too confident in their own cleverness. "Send me everything you have. I'll find what we need." She ended the call and immediately began gathering documents, pulling files from boxes, photographing and scanning and organizing. She worked through dinner and past midnight, and when she finally crawled into bed, her mind was racing with possibilities. Her flight to London left in 6 days. Chapter 3. The Call That Changed Everything. London greeted Sadia with rain that felt like a baptism, washing away the last remnants of who she'd been and making space for who she was becoming. The taxi carried her through streets that curved and climbed in ways American cities never did, past buildings older than her country, and people who walked with purpose despite weather that would have sent others running for shelter. She'd booked a hotel near the law offices. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough that she could pretend this was just a regular trip, instead of the moment her entire life was about to pivot. The hotel room had a window that overlooked a small park where children played on swings despite the drizzle, their laughter carrying up through the damp air like proof that joy could exist anywhere if you were brave enough to claim it. Sadia unpacked her suitcase and hung her clothes in the narrow closet, then stood under a hot shower until her skin turned pink and her muscles finally unclenched from the flight. She dressed in black pants and a cream silk blouse that Aunt Helena had once complimented, called it sophisticated without trying too hard. The law offices occupied the 3rd floor of a building that looked like it had witnessed centuries of human drama and remained unmoved by all of it. Sadia climbed stairs that creaked under expensive carpet and found herself in a reception area decorated with dark wood and leather furniture that smelled like old books and older money. A receptionist with silver hair and kind eyes greeted her warmly, offering tea that arrived in actual china cups. James Pemberton was older than Sadia expected, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a benevolent professor, rather than someone who managed the legal affairs of the wealthy. He rose when she entered his office and shook her hand with genuine warmth, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his massive desk that held neat stacks of papers and a photograph of what looked like grandchildren playing at a beach. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said, and his accent made her name sound more elegant than it ever had before. "Thank you for making the journey. I know this must be difficult, losing your aunt." Sadia felt tears prick unexpectedly at the kindness in his voice. "She was the best person in my family," Sadia said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "The only one who ever really saw me." James nodded like he understood completely. "Helena spoke of you often," he said. "She was immensely proud of who you'd become, despite what she called your unfortunate choice in husbands." Despite her sadness, Sadia laughed. "That sounds exactly like her." "No, she certainly didn't hold back," James agreed, and something in his expression suggested he had stories he could tell but wouldn't out of respect for the dead. He pulled a folder from one of the neat stacks and opened it carefully, revealing documents that looked official and important. Helena made her final will just months ago. She was very specific about her wishes and very clear about who should benefit from her life's work. Sadia's heart hammered against her ribs as James began reading, his cultured voice turning legal language into something almost poetic. Properties in London and Paris and Monaco, investments in companies Sadia had heard of and many she hadn't, stock portfolios and bonds and accounts in banks that sounded like they only dealt with people who understood money on levels Sadia was still learning to comprehend. The numbers kept climbing, each asset adding to a total that seemed impossible even as James read them with professional calm. When he finally reached the bottom line, the full estate value that would transfer to Sadia after taxes and fees, she stopped hearing anything except the blood rushing in her ears. $600 million, James repeated when he noticed her stunned silence. Give or take a few million, depending on currency fluctuations and final accounting. Helena built quite an empire, and she wanted you to have all of it. Sadia's hands trembled as she accepted the water James poured from a crystal pitcher, sipping slowly while she tried to process information that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. $600 million. The number was so large it stopped having meaning. There's a letter, James said gently, pulling an envelope from the folder. Helena asked me to give this to you personally when the will was read. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, expensive paper that felt substantial between Sadia's fingers. Her name was written across the front in Aunt Helena's distinctive handwriting, bold and confident. Sadia opened it carefully and pulled out pages covered in that same strong hand. The letter began with love, with Aunt Helena's voice so clear on the page that Sadia could almost hear her speaking the words aloud. She wrote about building her fortune from nothing, about men who'd tried to stop her and women who'd said it was impossible, about learning that the best revenge against people who underestimated you was living spectacularly well. She wrote about watching Sadia grow up, seeing the strength in her that others missed, knowing she had the steel inside her to do extraordinary things if she ever got the chance. The final paragraph made Sadia's tears spill over despite her attempt at composure. You married a fool who couldn't see your worth, and you've wasted years trying to be small enough for his limited vision. This money is my last gift to you, my darling girl. Use it to build the life you deserve, not the life small people tried to give you. Make them all sorry they ever underestimated you. And for heaven's sake, find a man who actually deserves you, instead of one who thinks you should be grateful for his attention. I love you, and I'm so proud of you. Now go be magnificent. Sadia pressed the letter against her chest and let herself cry properly for the first time since Gary had thrown those divorce papers at her, mourning her aunt and her marriage and all the years she'd spent believing other people's stories about her worth. James handed her tissues without comment and waited patiently until she'd composed herself enough to breathe normally again. Helena also left instructions, James said when Sadia had wiped her eyes and straightened her spine. She suggested several financial advisors and lawyers who could help you manage the estate. She was quite insistent that you protect yourself legally, particularly given your recent divorce. Sadia thought about Harrison Wright and his promise to find mistakes in Gary's prenuptial agreement. I've already retained a lawyer in the States, she said. Someone who specializes in finding hidden assets and invalidating unfair agreements. James' expression brightened with approval. Helena would be pleased. She always said you were smarter than you gave yourself credit for. They spent the next several hours going through paperwork, Sadia signing documents and opening accounts and beginning the process of transferring an empire from one woman to another. James explained the properties she now owned, including a townhouse in London that had been Helena's primary residence. Furnished with antiques and art, he offered to arrange a viewing whenever Sadia was ready, and she heard herself saying tomorrow. When she finally left the law offices late that afternoon, Sadia stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She was wealthy now, wealthy in ways that gave her power and options, and the ability to choose her own path, instead of following one someone else had laid out. She walked through London streets without any destination, letting the city absorb her shock and excitement and grief. She passed shops selling things she could now afford without thinking, restaurants where she could dine without checking prices, galleries full of art she could buy if she wanted. The rain had stopped, and evening light turned the wet pavement golden. Her phone had been off since the will reading, but she turned it on in a pub where she'd stopped for dinner and watched messages flood in. Nina asking how it went, Harrison Wright wanting to schedule a call about the prenup review, and 3 messages from Gary's mother that Sadia deleted without reading. She texted Nina first. "You won't believe what just happened. Call you when I get back to the hotel." Harrison's message was more urgent, and Sadia called him from a quiet corner of the pub while her food arrived. He answered on the second ring, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice before he even spoke. "I found it," he said without preamble. "Your husband committed fraud when he had you sign that prenuptial agreement. He hid assets, undervalued things, and violated multiple clauses that invalidate the entire contract. We can take him for everything he has." Sadia felt a smile spread across her face. "How long before we can move forward?" "I can file within the week," Harrison said. "But Mrs. Lawrence, I need to tell you something. Sometimes revenge isn't about money. Sometimes it's about watching them destroy themselves while you build something better." Sadia thought about that. "What do you suggest?" "Let the divorce go through as planned," Harrison said slowly. "Let him think he won. Then use your resources to dismantle everything he built, while he has no idea you have the power to do it." The idea was beautiful in its cruelty. "Let's do that," Sadia said, and her voice was steady as stone. That night in her hotel room, Sadia called Nina and told her everything. She read Aunt Helena's letter aloud over video chat and watched Nina cry along with her. They talked until nearly dawn London time, making plans and spinning dreams and laughing with wild joy. Before she fell asleep, Sadia opened her laptop and began researching. She looked up Gary's company and his biggest clients, made notes about his landlord and his lease terms, started building a map of his life that she could dismantle piece by careful piece. Chapter 4. The first move. Sadia returned from London transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the numbers in her bank accounts, and everything to do with the steel she'd rediscovered in her spine. She moved through customs at the airport like someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. And when she caught her reflection in the terminal windows, she saw Aunt Helena in her posture, in the way she carried her head high. The inheritance had been transferred, the accounts were active, and the world had become a chessboard where she finally had all the powerful pieces. Nina met her at baggage claim wearing sunglasses indoors and a grin that suggested she'd already started celebrating. They hugged in the way women do when they've been through wars together, holding on tight enough to confirm they're both still standing. On the drive back to Sadia's apartment, they talked strategy like generals planning a campaign, and Nina's enthusiasm for creative destruction was exactly what Sadia needed. The first order was Gary's building. Sadia sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and Nina's moral support, researching property ownership records until she found what she was looking for. The building that housed Gary's agency belonged to an investment group that was looking to sell, and their asking price was reasonable for someone with Sadia's resources. She contacted her new financial advisor, a woman named Constance, who managed portfolios for people who measured wealth in generations, and explained what she wanted. Constance made it happen within 3 days, using a shell corporation that buried Sadia's name under layers of legal entities. The building transferred ownership smoothly, and Gary had no idea his new landlord was the woman he'd discarded. Sadia celebrated by taking Nina to dinner at an expensive restaurant where the wine list required a sommelier to navigate. Gary's lease came up for renewal exactly 2 weeks later, and Sadia's property manager, a professional named Douglas who understood discretion, sent the new terms. The rent quadrupled overnight, and additional fees appeared for services that had previously been included. Douglas called Sadia personally to tell her about Gary's reaction, the screaming phone call where he'd threatened lawsuits. "What did you tell him?" Sadia asked. "I told him the new ownership had reviewed market rates and adjusted accordingly," Douglas said, and his dry tone suggested he'd enjoyed the conversation immensely. "He called me several names that aren't appropriate to repeat and insisted this was illegal. I reminded him that his lease renewal was entirely at the owner's discretion." Sadia thanked Douglas and ended the call feeling satisfaction warm her from the inside. She imagined Gary in his office, face red with rage, unable to comprehend how his fortunes had shifted so quickly. But the building was just the opening move. Sadia's real target was Gary's client list, the major accounts that kept his agency profitable. She'd spent her years as his wife, attending company events and industry conferences, smiling beside him while he networked. She knew which clients valued creativity over connections, which ones cared about results more than golf games. Her own company launched with a website that went live on a Tuesday morning, elegant and professional and backed by a portfolio of work that Sadia had been quietly building. She'd always had an eye for design and a gift for understanding what made people respond emotionally to advertising. Talents she'd suppressed during her marriage because Gary had made it clear that one star per family was plenty. The company was called Lawrence Creative, and its mission statement talked about authentic storytelling and emotional resonance. Sadia sent introductory packages to Gary's top 5 clients, beautiful presentations that showcased what her team could do without directly criticizing their current agency. The first client to respond was a beverage company that had been with Gary's agency for years, but had privately complained about stale ideas. Their marketing director called Sadia personally to request a meeting. They met at a cafe downtown, and Sadia listened more than she talked, asked questions about the company's values and vision. And by the end of their coffee, she had a new client, and Gary had lost 15% of his annual revenue. Nina insisted they celebrate each victory, so Sadia's apartment became headquarters for a campaign that felt more like art than revenge. They tracked Gary's company like meteorologists watching a storm system, noting when clients left and employees quit. Gary's social media presence became less frequent, his posts more defensive. The second client fell within a month, a fashion retailer that had been frustrated by Gary's inability to understand their target demographic. Sadia's team created a campaign that went viral within days, clever and touching. The client sent flowers to Sadia's office with a note that thanked her for understanding their vision. Meanwhile, Sadia's personal life had started shifting. Nina had dragged her to an art gallery opening, insisted that she needed to do more than work and plot revenge. The gallery specialized in architectural photography, massive prints of buildings from angles that made them look like sculptures. She'd been studying a photograph of a bridge when someone beside her said, "The photographer waited 6 months to capture that exact sunrise. I know because I designed the bridge and he sent me daily updates about weather and timing." Sadia turned and found herself looking at a man who seemed to be built from the same clean lines as the buildings in the photographs. He was tall and silver-haired, with eyes that looked like they paid attention to details other people missed. He wore a suit that fit him properly without trying too hard. "You're an architect?" Sadia asked. "Robert Klein," he said, offering his hand. "I design buildings that hopefully outlast me, and occasionally photograph well at sunrise." They talked about the exhibition, and about architecture, and about the way cities grew and changed like living organisms. Sadia realized she was genuinely enjoying herself for the first time in months outside of plotting Gary's destruction. Robert had traveled extensively and collected stories about buildings in distant cities. When the gallery started closing, Robert asked if she'd like to continue the conversation over dinner, and Sadia said yes, without hesitation. They went to a small Italian place where the owner greeted Robert by name. Over pasta, Sadia discovered that Robert was divorced, had 2 grown children who lived across the country, and approached relationships with the same careful attention he brought to his designs. He asked about her life, and Sadia surprised herself by telling him the truth. She talked about her divorce and her aunt's death and the inheritance that had changed everything. Robert listened without judgment or pity. When she mentioned Gary's name, Robert's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition. But he didn't comment, except to say that some people measured value in the wrong currency. They parted at her car with Robert asking if he could see her again, and Sadia said yes because she wanted to explore this warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with revenge. Nina called the next morning demanding details, and Sadia laughed while describing dinner and conversation that had lasted until the restaurant politely suggested they might want to continue elsewhere. Nina made approving sounds and insisted this was exactly what Sadia needed. But even as Sadia's personal life began to bloom, she kept her focus on the campaign against Gary. The 3rd client left his agency after a pitch meeting where his team apparently presented work that looked hastily assembled. Sadia's team landed the same account with a presentation that had taken weeks to perfect. Robert started spending more time at Sadia's apartment, bringing groceries and cooking meals and filling her space with presents that felt comfortable instead of invasive. They developed rhythms together, morning coffee and evening wine. He met Nina over brunch and charmed her completely. Gary's best employees continued quitting. 3 more left in a single week, and industry gossip suggested they'd all received offers from competitors, including Lawrence Creative. Sadia hadn't directly recruited them, but her company's reputation meant people sought her out. She hired the ones who impressed her during interviews. The building landlord called to inform Sadia that Gary was struggling to make rent payments. Sadia authorized Douglas to arrange a payment plan that would keep Gary trapped in obligation without forcing immediate crisis. Slow strangulation was more effective than quick execution. "You're enjoying this too much," Nina said during one of their strategic planning sessions, but her tone held admiration. "You've become an artist of revenge." "I'm not enjoying his suffering," Sadia corrected. "I'm enjoying building something excellent. The fact that Gary's agency can't compete isn't about him anymore." Robert took her to an industry awards ceremony where Lawrence Creative won 3 major honors. Sadia walked to the stage in a dress that cost more than her first car. Gary sat in the audience because his agency had been nominated for nothing. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. Gary's world started cracking in ways that would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention, but Sadia watched every fracture with the focus of someone who'd mapped the fault lines herself. His agency lost its 4th client on a Thursday afternoon, and Sadia learned about it from an industry newsletter before Gary probably finished processing the news himself. The client was a tech company that had stuck with Gary out of habit more than satisfaction, and Sadia's team had shown them possibilities that made habit seem like a waste of potential. She read the announcement twice, savoring each word like expensive wine, then forwarded it to Nina with a single champagne emoji. The real satisfaction came an hour later when her phone rang with an unlisted number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her this call would be worth taking. Gary's voice exploded through the speaker before she could say hello, raw and unhinged in ways she'd never heard from him before. He was screaming about her destroying him, about knowing she was behind everything, about how she'd better stop, or he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of vindictive woman she really was. Sadia listened in silence, letting him exhaust himself with threats that held no power, and when he finally ran out of breath, she spoke with a calmness that was more devastating than any anger could have been. "Gary, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, and her voice was silk wrapped around steel. "I have my own company to run. I don't have time to think about your problems. If clients are leaving you, perhaps you should examine why they're unhappy with your work, instead of blaming other people for your failures." He hung up on her, and Sadia sat staring at her phone, feeling something dark and satisfying curl in her chest. She'd gotten under his skin so thoroughly that he was losing control, making emotional phone calls that would only make him look desperate to anyone who heard about them. She saved his number in her contacts under blocked trash and made a mental note to document any future attempts at contact in case he escalated further. Barbara called on Friday morning, and Sadia almost didn't answer, because she'd learned that Gary's mother only reached out when she wanted something or needed to deliver judgment disguised as concern. But curiosity won, and Sadia picked up on the fourth ring to hear Barbara's voice stripped of its usual condescension and replaced with something that sounded dangerously close to panic mixed with barely controlled rage. "Sadia," Barbara said, and she pronounced the name like she was spitting poison. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you deliberately sabotaging my son's business?" Sadia settled into her couch with her coffee and waited, letting the silence stretch until Barbara filled it with questions that revealed more than she probably intended. Did Sadia have anything to do with Gary's recent troubles? Had she been contacting his clients? Did she know who bought the building where his agency operated? Had she been spreading rumors about Gary's work quality? Was she using her new connections to blacklist him in the industry? The questions came rapid-fire, desperate, each one exposing how much Barbara had pieced together and how little she could actually prove. "I have my own company now," Sadia said, when Barbara finally stopped for breath, and her voice carried ice that could freeze oceans. "I'm focused on my own success, not on whatever challenges Gary might be facing. The industry is competitive, and sometimes agencies lose clients. It happens to everyone eventually. Perhaps if Gary had spent more time building quality relationships with his clients instead of taking them for granted, they wouldn't be so eager to work with someone else." "This isn't normal," Barbara insisted, and her voice climbed toward hysteria in a way that would have horrified her country club friends if they could hear it. 6 clients in 3 months, his best employees quitting, rent he can barely afford, phone calls from creditors. Someone is targeting him deliberately, systematically destroying everything he's built, and I think you know exactly who that someone is. Sadia felt a smile curve her lips, even though Barbara couldn't see it through the phone. "Barbara, you came to my apartment after the divorce to tell me how mature women needed to accept reality gracefully. You stood in my modest kitchen and explained that Gary deserved happiness with someone younger and more energetic. You attended his engagement party to that secretary while I was in London, burying my aunt, and learning I'd inherited more money than your entire family will ever see. You've made it very clear that I'm not part of your family anymore, that I don't matter, that I should disappear quietly into whatever pathetic future you imagined for divorced women who couldn't keep their husbands interested. So why would I know anything about Gary's business affairs? We're divorced. His problems aren't my responsibility. And frankly, they're not my concern either." Barbara made a sound that was half sob, half rage, and Sadia could picture her in her expensive home office surrounded by photos of Gary at various stages of his entitled life, realizing that the woman she'd dismissed so casually had somehow become more powerful than anyone in her family. "If you're doing this, if you're somehow behind his failures, you need to stop. He's my son, and whatever he did to you, he's still my son. I'm watching him fall apart, watching him lose everything he worked for, and I know you're enjoying every second of it. What I enjoy is building a successful company, attending charity galas where I'm recognized as a major donor, and planning a future with someone who actually values me," Sadia replied, and her voice carried truth that was more cutting than lies. "If Gary's agency can't compete with mine, if his clients prefer my team's work, if his employees would rather work for someone who treats them with respect, those are consequences of his choices, not results of my actions. I didn't make him mediocre, Barbara. I just stopped hiding his mediocrity by being the invisible support system that made him look better than he actually was." "You're destroying him," Barbara whispered, and the certainty in her voice suggested she'd finally accepted what she'd been denying. "You're taking everything from him piece by piece, and you're doing it deliberately, methodically, like you've been planning this all along." "I'm living my life," Sadia corrected, "and if my life happens to be more successful than his, if my company happens to be better than his agency, if the industry happens to recognize that I'm more talented than he ever gave me credit for, those aren't my problems to solve. They're his reality to accept." Barbara hung up without another word, and Sadia sat holding her phone, feeling powerful in ways that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with knowing she'd finally stopped accepting other people's narratives about her worth. She texted Nina about the call, and Nina responded with several fire emojis and a message that said Barbara's desperation was the most delicious thing she'd heard all week, followed by a request to meet for lunch so they could celebrate properly. That same afternoon, Sadia received an invitation to the Children's Hospital Gala, the annual charity event, where Barbara had been chairwoman longer than most people had been married. The invitation was addressed to Sadia Lorenz and guest, which meant someone on the committee had been paying attention to her rising profile in the business community and had added her name over Barbara's certain objections. Nina called it strategic social warfare when Sadia showed her the heavy cardstock with its embossed lettering, and they both knew this was an opportunity too perfect to refuse, a chance to demonstrate her transformation in front of everyone who dismissed her as Gary's discarded wife. Sadia called Robert that evening and asked if he'd like to accompany her to a charity gala, warned him it might be awkward, given that her ex-husband's mother ran the event, and her ex-husband would probably be there with his secretary-turned-fiancé. Robert laughed, that warm sound that had become familiar comfort, and said he'd worn uncomfortable tuxedos for less interesting reasons than watching someone navigate their past with dignity and style. They spent 20 minutes on the phone discussing what to wear, and whether arriving fashionably late would be petty or strategic. And Sadia felt grateful for someone who took her seriously enough to plot social appearances like military campaigns that required careful planning and precise execution. The gala was scheduled for the following weekend, which gave Sadia time to prepare in ways that went beyond just choosing a dress. She met with Constance to discuss charitable giving, and her financial advisor helped her understand the kind of donation that would make news without seeming ostentatious or desperate for attention. They settled on $2 million for the new children's wing, enough to be the largest single donation in the hospital's history, but structured in a way that emphasized Sadia's commitment to children's health rather than making a statement about personal wealth or proving a point to her ex-husband's family. The dress she chose was custom Valentino, deep emerald green that made her skin glow and her eyes look mysterious even to herself. The designer had flown in for the fitting, bringing an assistant and enough fabric samples to carpet her apartment. And Sadia had stood in her living room while women pinned and adjusted and transformed her into someone who looked like she belonged in magazines instead of just reading them. Nina came for the final fitting and cried, actual tears that she blamed on allergies, but that both of them knew came from witnessing transformation that had nothing to do with fabric and everything to do with claiming space in the world that had tried to deny her. Gary's engagement party to Amber had happened the week before the gala, and Sadia knew because industry friends had sent her photos with commentary that ranged from sympathetic to viciously entertained. The venue had been downgraded from the luxury hotel Gary had promised to something significantly less impressive. A hotel conference room with fluorescent lighting that no amount of decorating could make elegant. The guest list had clearly been affected by Gary's professional difficulties, with notable absences from people who'd once considered themselves his closest friends, but who now had convenient scheduling conflicts. Amber wore a dress that tried too hard and jewelry that looked rented rather than owned, and her smile had an edge of panic that suggested she was starting to understand that Gary's promises were written in disappearing ink that faded faster every day. Gary himself looked strained in the photos, his tuxedo hanging slightly wrong on a frame that had lost weight from stress rather than exercise. And his expression carried the desperation of a man trying to convince everyone, including himself, that everything was fine, even as his life burned quietly around him. His mother stood beside them wearing a smile that looked painted on, and all three of them appeared to be posing for a picture of happiness they hoped would manifest if they just believed hard enough and ignored reality long enough. Nina had forwarded Sadia one particular photo with just a string of laughing emojis, and Sadia had studied it longer than she should have. The image captured a moment where Gary's mask had slipped, where his face showed the fear and confusion and anger of someone watching their world collapse without understanding how to stop it. She'd felt something then, not quite sympathy, but not quite satisfaction either, a complicated mixture of emotions that reminded her that revenge was messier in reality than it seemed in planning. She deleted the photo after memorizing it, let it go like releasing a balloon into sky that would carry it away from her life forever, though the image stayed burned in her memory like a brand. The night of the gala arrived with weather that cooperated beautifully. Clear skies and temperatures that allowed for elegant dresses without the indignity of needing coats that would hide all the expensive tailoring. Robert arrived at Sadia's apartment looking distinguished in his tuxedo, and he brought flowers that he said matched her eyes, which made her laugh because it was such a classic move, executed with such genuine sincerity, that it worked anyway despite being a line she'd heard in movies. They took a car service to the hotel, and Sadia watched the city slide past her window while Robert told stories about other charity galas he'd attended, where the drama rivaled anything scripted for television, where fortunes changed hands and reputations were built or destroyed over champagne and silent auctions. The ballroom was decorated within an inch of its life, flowers and lights and ice sculptures that would melt before the evening ended. Temporary beauty funded by permanent money from people who measured their worth in donations large enough to get their names on buildings. Barbara stood near the entrance greeting guests with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd perfected the art of making donors feel important. Wearing a gown that probably cost as much as most people's cars, and an expression that suggested she was already exhausted from performing graciousness for people she privately considered beneath her. Sadia watched her greet donor after donor with mechanical precision, saw the exact moment Barbara's eyes found her across the room, and widened with something that looked like panic before smoothing back into professional welcome that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. Sadia and Robert made their entrance deliberately, taking time to greet people she knew from her own expanding network of professional relationships and industry contacts who'd become genuine friends rather than just convenient acquaintances. Industry colleagues congratulated her on recent award wins with enthusiasm that seemed authentic, and several people introduced themselves specifically because they'd heard about Lorent's creative and wanted to discuss potential collaborations or just tell her how much they admired what she'd built. Robert stood beside her looking appropriately impressed and utterly genuine in his support, his hand occasionally settling on her back in ways that communicated partnership rather than possession, equality rather than ownership. When they finally reached the donation table after making their way through the crowd, Sadia requested the pledge card for the highest giving tier and wrote her contribution amount with flourishes that made the volunteers' eyes go wide with shock and then wider with disbelief. The woman processing the donation looked at the number, looked at Sadia, looked back at the number like maybe she'd misread it the first time, and then reached for a phone to call someone who probably had authority to accept commitments that large without prior approval from the board. The hospital director appeared within minutes, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who'd spent her career fighting for children's health and clearly understood the politics of fundraising, even if she'd rather be treating patients than courting donors. She shook Sadia's hand with the grip of someone who meant it and thanked her with words that sounded rehearsed until she added with genuine emotion breaking through, "This will change lives. Real children will get treatment they couldn't afford otherwise because of your generosity. You're saving lives tonight." Barbara materialized like a ghost, summoned by humiliation, her face the color of old milk, and Sadia watched her struggle to maintain composure while learning that her former daughter-in-law had just become the most significant donor in the organization's history by a margin that made everyone else's contributions look insignificant. Photographers who'd been circulating the room converged like sharks, sensing blood in the water, and Sadia posed for pictures with Dr. Reeves, while Barbara stood to the side, looking like she'd swallowed glass and was choking on it slowly. Chapter 6. The Social Execution. Sadia woke the morning after the gala to find her face in society pages and industry publications, photographs that captured her elegance and Robert's presence, and the unmistakable message that she had arrived in circles that used to merely tolerate her. The articles praised her generosity and mentioned her company's rapid success, painting a picture of transformation that felt both accurate and incomplete because they couldn't see the strategy beneath the surface. Robert called before noon to tell her she'd been magnificent last night, his voice warm with admiration that sounded genuine because it was. They made plans for dinner that evening, and Sadia found herself looking forward to it with anticipation that had nothing to do with revenge. The industry responded to her gala appearance faster than she'd anticipated. Her phone rang throughout the day with calls from potential clients who'd seen the coverage and wanted to discuss working with Lawrence Creative. Sadia took the meetings that interested her and politely declined the ones that felt like people chasing trends. Gary's fifth client left him on Tuesday, a major automotive account that had been with his agency since its founding. Sadia learned about it from an industry contact who called to congratulate her because the client had explicitly mentioned choosing Lawrence Creative based on their recent award-winning work. The contract was worth millions annually, and Sadia knew losing it would push Gary's agency from struggling into crisis territory. Nina stopped by that evening with takeout and champagne, insisting they celebrate every victory, no matter how small. They sat on Sadia's couch reviewing the past week's developments, and Nina kept track on a mental scoreboard that had Sadia ahead by numbers that would have seemed impossible months ago. "He has to know it's you by now," Nina said, sipping champagne. "There's no way he thinks this is all coincidence." Sadia considered that. "He suspects, but he can't prove anything. Every client I've taken made their decision based on merit. Every employee who left chose better opportunities. His landlord raised rent to market rates. Nothing I've done is illegal or even questionable. I'm just better at this than he ever was." "You're better at everything than he ever was," Nina corrected. "But now you have the resources to prove it." Robert arrived to pick Sadia up for dinner, looking casually elegant. They went to a French restaurant that he'd been wanting to try. The sommelier recognized Robert and made recommendations that proved excellent. Over duck confit and wine that tasted expensive because it was. Robert told her about his current project designing a library for a small town that had never had one before. He talked about community spaces and natural light and creating buildings that invited people in. "Why architecture?" she asked, genuinely curious. Robert thought about it while their waiter refilled wine glasses. "Because buildings outlast us," he finally said. "I'll be gone someday, but something I designed might stand for 100 years. It might shelter people I'll never meet. That feels like it matters." Sadia understood that desire to create something lasting. She told him about her plans to expand Lorentz Creative internationally, about wanting to build something that would employ people and produce work that mattered. "Tell me about your marriage," Robert said as dessert arrived, and his tone was careful. "You've mentioned your divorce, but I don't really know what happened beyond the basics." Sadia had been expecting this question eventually. She told him about Gary, about the years of feeling invisible and the birthday that ended her marriage, and the way being discarded had somehow been the catalyst for finding herself again. She told him about Aunt Helena and the inheritance and the campaign she'd waged against Gary's agency. "So you're systematically destroying your ex-husband's business," Robert said when she'd finished, and his tone was neutral. "That's quite an undertaking. Does it bother you?" Sadia asked, needing to know. Robert was quiet for a moment. "I think people who underestimate others deserve to learn from their mistakes," he finally said. "And I think you're being remarkably restrained, given that you could probably destroy him completely if you wanted to. Taking his clients because you're better at the work isn't revenge, it's just capitalism functioning properly." Sadia felt something loosen in her chest. "I was worried you'd think I was being petty or cruel." "I think you're being strategic," Robert corrected. "There's a difference between wanting someone to suffer and wanting them to understand consequences." They finished dinner talking about lighter things. He drove her home and walked her to her door, and when he kissed her goodnight, it was with the kind of intention that suggested he was thinking about this becoming something more serious. "I'd like to see you again," Robert said. "I'd like to see you often, actually, if that's something you'd want too." Sadia kissed him again instead of answering with words. Inside her apartment, Sadia found a voicemail from Barbara that had arrived during dinner. She almost deleted it without listening, but curiosity won. "Sadia, this is Barbara. I need to speak with you urgently. Gary's agency is in serious trouble, and I think you know why. Whatever you're doing, whatever revenge you think you're getting, you need to stop before you destroy his life completely. He made a mistake ending your marriage the way he did, and maybe he deserves some consequences, but this has gone too far. Call me back." Sadia deleted the message and blocked Barbara's number because rational adults didn't show up at your door after divorce to gloat about their son's new girlfriend and then demand mercy when consequences arrived. Gary's agency declared losses for the quarter, and the news appeared in trade publications. Sadia's company announced record growth in the same publications, and the contrast was noted by industry observers who wrote analyses about shifting market dynamics. Her name appeared in articles about women entrepreneurs. The seventh client left Gary's agency after a pitch meeting where his team apparently presented work that looked hastily assembled. Sadia's team landed the same account with a presentation that had taken weeks to perfect. Robert started spending more time at Sadia's apartment, bringing groceries and cooking meals. They developed rhythms together, morning coffee and evening wine, and conversations that ranged from profound to ridiculous. He met Nina over brunch and charmed her completely. Gary's best employees continued quitting. 3 more left in a single week. Sadia hadn't directly recruited them, but her company's reputation for treating employees well meant people sought her out. The building landlord called to inform Sadia that Gary was 2 months behind on rent. Sadia authorized Douglas to offer payment plans that would keep Gary trapped in debt, while believing he'd been shown mercy. Nina reported seeing Barbara occasionally at charity events, where she volunteered with genuine commitment instead of just seeking social status. Whether that transformation was authentic or just another performance, Sadia didn't know and didn't need to investigate. That night, Sadia pulled out her laptop and began researching lawyers again, but this time for a different reason. She was thinking about foundations and charitable giving and creating systemic change. Robert found her working late and wrapped his arms around her. "What are you planning now?" he asked. "Something better than revenge," she said. "Something that actually helps people instead of just hurting one person who hurt me." Robert kissed the top of her head. "That sounds like growth." The industry awards ceremony, where Lawrence Creative won 3 major honors, became a turning point. Sadia walked to the stage, accepting accolades, and she dedicated the award to Aunt Helena, who taught her that being underestimated was only permanent if you accepted other people's limitations. Gary sent one final message, asking to meet for coffee. Sadia declined through an intermediary, explaining that she'd already found closure. Robert supported her decision without trying to influence it. Their marriage worked because neither of them needed the other to be less so. They could be more. Nina got engaged that year, and Sadia threw her the kind of celebration Nina had thrown for her. They'd been through wars together, and watching Nina find happiness felt like victory they shared. Barbara made one final attempt at contact, showing up at Lawrence Creative's main office. They met in a conference room, and Barbara talked about recognizing her mistakes. "I taught him that he was special just for existing," Barbara said. "I never made him work for anything. When he threw you away, I cheered him on. I was wrong about everything." Sadia listened without interrupting. When Barbara finished, Sadia was quiet before responding. "I appreciate you recognizing that you hurt me," Sadia said. "But apologies don't erase harm, and I'm not interested in rebuilding a relationship with you. I've moved on from that part of my life. I hope you've learned from your mistakes, and I hope you treat future daughters-in-law better. But I need you to understand that I'm done with your family." Barbara nodded and left, looking relieved to have said what needed saying. Chapter 7. The Empire Strikes. The morning Sadia launched her international expansion, storm clouds gathered over Gary's agency in ways that stopped being metaphorical and started being literal bankruptcy. She stood in her conference room, presenting to investors from London and Tokyo, her team behind her and conviction in her voice. And she watched powerful people nod with understanding that Lawrence Creative was exactly the kind of company worth backing with serious capital. Robert sat in the back of the room because he'd asked to watch her in action. The investors committed funding that would allow her to open offices in 3 countries within the next year. She celebrated that evening with her team, champagne and laughter, and plans that felt ambitious but achievable. Nina had arranged the party and invited everyone who mattered. Gary's agency declared bankruptcy on a Tuesday afternoon, and the news spread through industry circles faster than wildfire through dry grass. Sadia heard about it from 3 different sources within an hour. She sat at her desk reading the official statement that talked about market challenges and strategic restructuring, and she felt something close to satisfaction, but not quite the triumph she'd expected. The bankruptcy filing listed debts that exceeded assets by margins that suggested fundamental mismanagement. Creditors included the building landlord, former employees owed severance, vendors waiting on unpaid invoices. Gary's personal guarantees on business loans meant his personal assets would be vulnerable to liquidation. Amber left him that same week. Nina heard it from someone who'd heard it from Amber's hairstylist. Amber had discovered that the engagement ring was rented rather than purchased, that Gary's promises about their future together were built on debt and lies. She'd cleaned out their joint checking account before leaving. Nina told the story over lunch at a new restaurant, and Sadia listened while picking at her food because the news felt heavier than she'd anticipated. She'd wanted Gary to understand consequences, wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused her, but watching his complete destruction was complicated by empathy she didn't want to feel. You're allowed to feel bad for him, Nina said, reading Sadia's expression correctly. Being hurt by someone doesn't mean you have to be happy watching them suffer. I know, Sadia said, but she wondered if that was entirely true. She'd engineered much of Gary's downfall deliberately. I just thought I'd feel more satisfied when this moment came. Robert found her that evening, sitting on her couch staring at nothing, and he didn't ask questions before sitting beside her and pulling her close. They stayed like that until Sadia felt ready to talk. Do you regret it? Robert asked when she'd finished explaining. Taking his clients, destroying his agency? Sadia considered that question carefully. I don't regret building something excellent, she finally said. I don't regret proving I was capable of success. But I do regret that his destruction was part of my motivation instead of just his loss being a side effect of my success. There's a difference between winning because you're excellent and winning because you're determined to make someone else lose. That's growth, Robert said gently. Recognizing that difference means you haven't lost yourself in the revenge. Barbara called 3 days after the bankruptcy filing. Sadia answered because refusing contact now felt petty. Barbara's voice was stripped of its usual authority. He's moving back home, Barbara said without preamble. The apartment was too expensive without Amber helping with rent, and he's lost everything else. Sadia closed her eyes and pictured Gary packing boxes. I'm sorry that happened, she said, and meant it despite everything. Is it enough? Barbara asked, and the question held desperation. Have you proven whatever you needed to prove? Can you stop now and let him try to rebuild? Barbara, I haven't done anything to Gary in weeks, Sadia said truthfully. His bankruptcy resulted from his own mismanagement. I didn't force those clients to leave. They chose to work with a company that served them better. You took everything from him, Barbara whispered. His business, his reputation, his confidence. He sits in his room all day. He's broken, Sadia, completely broken. Sadia felt tears prick her eyes. What do you want me to do? I can't give him back his clients or his agency. I can't undo the past several months. I can't fix what's broken in him, especially since I didn't break those parts. He did that himself when he chose cruelty over kindness. I want you to feel guilty, Barbara said with sudden venom. I want you to understand that you destroyed a human being. I want you to live with the knowledge that you're not the victim anymore. You're the villain. The call ended abruptly, and Sadia sat holding her phone while Barbara's words echoed in her mind. Nina came over that evening, uninvited. They sat together drinking wine, and eventually Nina said the thing Sadia had been thinking. You didn't make Gary throw divorce papers at you on your birthday. You didn't make him call you too old and parade his replacement in front of you. You didn't make him treat you like you were disposable. All you did was refuse to be disposed of quietly. I know, Sadia said. But knowing that doesn't make hearing about him broken in his childhood bedroom feel less complicated. Complicated is okay, Nina replied. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about complicated situations. Lorentz Creative's international expansion launched successfully, with offices opening in London first and Tokyo and Paris scheduled to follow. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. She gave interviews where she talked about second chances and refusing to accept other people's limitations. Robert's hand was in almost every photograph from the launch events. They'd stopped pretending this was casual dating and acknowledged they were building something serious. Sadia moved carefully toward that future, learning to trust again. Gary's father called requesting a meeting, and Sadia agreed. They met at a coffee shop that was neutral territory. He looked older than she remembered. I was wrong about you, he said simply. When Gary divorced you, I thought you'd be fine. I didn't understand that you'd been trapped in a marriage that prevented you from showing what you were capable of. I see that now. Sadia accepted the apology with a nod. Thank you for saying that. But I need to ask you something, he continued. Is there anything you can do to help Gary? Not give him money or clients, but maybe advice about how to start over. Sadia thought about that request carefully. I'm not the right person to help Gary rebuild, she said gently. I'm not objective enough to give him useful advice. But there are resources for entrepreneurs who've experienced failure. I can send you information about those." "He won't listen to me," Gary's father said with frustration. "He thinks everyone's against him now. He doesn't understand that his failure was his own fault." "Then he's not ready to rebuild yet," Sadia replied, "until he accepts responsibility for his choices instead of blaming everyone else. He can't learn from his mistakes. That's not something I can fix for him." They parted cordially, and Sadia sent him the resources she'd promised, even though she doubted Gary would use them. The industry started treating her like an established leader rather than an emerging talent. Sadia accepted opportunities that aligned with her values and declined those that felt like she was being used for her name recognition. Robert's library project was completed, and he took Sadia to see it before the public opening. They walked through spaces filled with natural light and comfortable furniture and books waiting to be read. "This is what matters," Robert said as they stood in the children's section. "Not whether people remember my name, but whether this building serves its purpose long after I'm gone." Sadia understood that sentiment completely. She thought about Aunt Helena building an empire not for recognition, but for the satisfaction of proving that a woman could succeed. Gary sent her an email late one night. The message was long and rambling, full of apologies and accusations mixed together. He said he was sorry for the birthday and the divorce papers and calling her too old, but he also blamed her for destroying him deliberately. The email ended with a question. Was I really that terrible? Did I deserve to lose everything because I made a mistake? Sadia drafted and deleted several responses before finally writing something honest. You didn't lose everything because you made a mistake. You lost everything because you built your life on foundations that couldn't support their own weight. I didn't destroy your agency. I just stopped being the invisible support system that made your mediocrity look like excellence. She hit send before she could reconsider, then blocked his email address. Nina threw Sadia a birthday party for her 41st. The cake was beautiful and the company was warm. Robert gave her a gift that night, a framed sketch he'd drawn of the building where her London office would open. His inscription read, "For someone who rebuilds cities after they've been burned." She was learning that revenge had limits, that destroying someone else's life didn't heal the wounds they'd inflicted. The most radical thing she could do now wasn't continuing to punish Gary, but rather choosing to stop caring whether he learned his lesson. Chapter 8: The Complete Collapse. 6 months after Gary's bankruptcy, Sadia stood in her London office, looking out at a city that felt both foreign and familiar, watching rain streak the windows while she processed numbers that still didn't feel entirely real. Lawrence Creative had exceeded every projection, growing into something that matched her ambitions without requiring her to sacrifice her principles. The team she'd built worked with passion and precision, creating campaigns that won awards and moved products and changed how companies thought about connecting with audiences. Robert visited her in London, taking time away from his own projects to spend weekends exploring the city together, and evenings cooking in the kitchen of the townhouse she'd inherited from Aunt Helena. The house was magnificent in ways that photographs couldn't capture, full of antiques and art and memories of a woman who'd lived fiercely without apology. News reached her through Nina that Gary had taken a position at a rival agency, junior-level work that probably stung his pride but paid his bills and got him out of his parents' house. He'd moved into a studio apartment across town and was apparently trying to rebuild some version of a life from the wreckage. Sadia felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy hearing this, just a distant acknowledgement that he was surviving. Amber had moved to another city entirely, and rumors suggested she'd found another older man with money. Sadia hoped the new relationship worked out better for everyone involved. Barbara sent Sadia a letter rather than calling. The letter apologized for their previous conversations, acknowledged that Sadia had been treated unfairly by their family, and expressed something that sounded like grudging respect. There was no request for reconciliation or forgiveness, just an acknowledgement that Barbara had been wrong. Sadia kept the letter in her desk drawer without responding because some apologies deserved acknowledgement and some deserved to be accepted without needing to continue the relationship. Barbara had been cruel when Sadia was vulnerable. Robert proposed on a Tuesday morning in Sadia's apartment, no elaborate production or public gesture, just a question asked over coffee, while morning light filled the kitchen where she'd once signed divorce papers with shaking hands. He didn't get on one knee or make a speech, just looked at her across the table and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life as her partner. Sadia said yes, because she'd learned the difference between someone who wanted her as an accessory and someone who valued her as an equal. Robert's ring was beautiful in its simplicity, and they called Nina immediately. The engagement party happened at Nina's insistence. Robert's children flew in to meet Sadia properly. Adults with their own lives who welcomed her warmly. They told stories about Robert that made Sadia laugh and shared family traditions. Gary's name came up exactly once during the party when someone who didn't know better asked about Sadia's first marriage, and she answered briefly that it had ended because they'd wanted different things. She didn't elaborate or explain or reveal anything about the war they'd waged. Lawrence Creative hired its 500th employee on a Thursday, and Sadia gave a speech about company values and treating people well. She talked about second chances and authentic talent and refusing to accept limitations. The company's success had made Sadia wealthy beyond what Aunt Helena's inheritance alone would have provided. She'd established scholarships for women entrepreneurs and funded programs that help people recover from business failures. Robert's architectural firm and Lawrence Creative collaborated on a project designing and marketing a community center for an underserved neighborhood. Working together felt natural. Nina became Sadia's maid of honor without needing to be asked. They spent an afternoon trying on dresses and drinking champagne while discussing how much their lives had changed. Gary sent a wedding gift that arrived without warning, an expensive vase that looked like something he'd received as a gift himself and never used. The card was brief, wishing her happiness and apologizing again. Sadia donated the vase to a charity shop without keeping it. Robert found her standing in her office late one night, looking at the city spread below. Eventually, he asked what she was thinking about. "I was thinking about the woman I was when Gary threw those divorce papers at me," she said. "How small I felt, how certain I was that he'd destroyed my life. I'm grateful to her for signing those papers without fighting. She was braver than she knew." "She was you," Robert reminded her gently. "You were always that brave. You just needed circumstances that let you prove it to yourself." Sadia turned to face him and kissed him softly. She'd been married before to someone who'd needed her to be less, and she was about to marry someone who celebrated her being more. The wedding planning consumed weeks of attention that Sadia had to consciously balance against work responsibilities. But Robert made it easy by genuinely caring about details. They chose flowers together and tasted cake samples and debated venues. Gary's junior position at the rival agency apparently wasn't working out well. Nina reported that he'd been let go after conflicts with supervisors. He'd filed for unemployment and was apparently spending his days sending resumes. The most radical thing Sadia had done wasn't destroying Gary's agency, but rather stopping her focus on his suffering and redirecting that energy toward building something beautiful. She'd learned that revenge had limits, that destruction for its own sake was ultimately empty. Barbara made one final attempt at contact, showing up at Lawrence Creative's main office requesting a meeting. Sadia's assistant called to ask what she wanted to do, and Sadia surprised herself by saying yes. "I came to tell you that I understand now," Barbara said, and her voice carried exhaustion. Gary destroyed his own life, and you just refused to let him destroy yours along with it. I'm sorry I blamed you for protecting yourself. Sadia accepted the apology with a nod. Thank you for saying that. I hope Gary finds his way to a life that makes him happy, but I can't be part of that journey. He asks about you sometimes, Barbara said quietly. Wants to know if you're happy, whether you ever think about him, whether you've forgiven him. Tell him I've moved on, Sadia replied. Tell him I'm happy, that I'm building a life I love with someone who loves me properly. Tell him forgiveness isn't about him anymore. It's about me choosing peace over anger. Barbara left looking older and sadder, and Sadia watched her go, feeling lighter. Robert took her to dinner that night, and they talked about honeymoon destinations and where they might eventually buy a house together. These were the conversations of people building futures together. The final piece of Gary's story reached Sadia through industry channels. He'd given up on advertising entirely and taken a position managing social media for a small non-profit. The salary was a fraction of what he'd made before, but he'd stopped chasing status and started accepting reality. She felt nothing learning this, except maybe distant relief that he'd found something stable. His story had ended the way stories about people who refused accountability usually did. Lorentz Creative's anniversary party celebrated a company that had exceeded every expectation. She thanked them for their talent and dedication. Several people gave speeches about company culture. Robert stood beside her through the celebration. They were building empires in different fields, but with similar values. The greatest revenge wasn't making Gary suffer, but rather building a life so magnificent that he became irrelevant to it. His approval no longer mattered, his opinion held no weight. He'd become a story she'd tell occasionally about transformation. That night, standing on her balcony with Robert's arms around her, Sadia thought about the woman who'd signed divorce papers on her birthday and thanked her cruel husband for the gift. She'd been right to do so. Aunt Helena would have been proud. She'd taken the inheritance and the lessons and built something worthy of that trust. Chapter 9. The Final Destruction. Sadia's wedding day arrived with sunshine that felt like approval from Aunt Helena, somewhere watching, bright and warm, without being oppressive. The ceremony happened in a garden that Robert had designed specifically for intimate gatherings. Surrounded by friends who'd witnessed her transformation and family, who'd loved her even when she'd forgotten to love herself. Nina stood beside her, wearing a dress the color of champagne and tears that she blamed on allergies, but that everyone knew came from joy. Robert waited at the altar, wearing a suit that fit him perfectly and an expression that suggested he understood exactly how fortunate he was. When Sadia walked toward him, she felt no doubt about the choice she was making. This was partnership instead of performance, collaboration instead of competition. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises about supporting each other's dreams and navigating difficulties together and choosing kindness even when anger felt easier. Gary wasn't invited to the wedding, obviously, but his absence felt notable anyway because people who knew Sadia's history couldn't help comparing her first marriage to this one. The differences were stark enough to make anyone who'd attended both ceremonies understand exactly what had changed. This time, Sadia glowed with genuine happiness instead of performing joy she didn't feel. This time, her partner looked at her like she was the prize. And this time, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. The reception overflowed with people who actually cared about the couple getting married. Speeches were funny and touching without being cruel to anyone, and the dancing went late into the evening. Sadia danced with Robert until her feet hurt, then danced with Nina while they laughed about how far they'd come. Gary showed up uninvited during the reception, appearing at the garden entrance looking disheveled and desperate, and security moved to escort him out before he could create a scene. Sadia saw him through the crowd, saw his face when he looked at her in her wedding dress, surrounded by people who loved her, and she felt something close to pity that she immediately suppressed. Robert saw him too, and his hand tightened on Sadia's protectively before she whispered that it was fine, that Gary couldn't hurt her anymore. Security escorted Gary away quietly while the party continued, unaware of the brief drama. "Are you okay?" Robert asked when Gary had disappeared from view. "I'm perfect," Sadia replied, and she meant it completely. "He's a ghost from a life I don't live anymore. He can't haunt me unless I let him, and I choose not to." The honeymoon took them to Monaco, where Aunt Helena had owned a villa overlooking the Mediterranean, with views that made every sunrise feel like a private show. They spent days exploring the coast and evenings on the terrace, drinking wine while watching light change across water. Robert was easy to travel with, interested in everything and demanding of nothing. Back home, Laurent's Creative continued thriving beyond anyone's projections. The international offices were exceeding performance targets, and the company's reputation had grown to the point where potential clients approached them. Sadia had built something sustainable that would continue growing, whether she personally ran it forever or eventually stepped back. Gary's life had apparently stabilized into something modest but functional. Nina reported that he seemed to be genuinely trying to rebuild himself into a better person, rather than just a successful one. He'd started therapy according to mutual acquaintances. Sadia hoped the therapy helped him, because everyone deserved the chance to grow from their mistakes. But his growth or lack thereof no longer impacted her life. The most surprising development came from Barbara, who sent Sadia a Christmas card that year with a note inside, apologizing again and expressing genuine happiness about Sadia's marriage and success. The note was brief but seemed sincere. There was no request for ongoing relationship or forgiveness beyond what had already been offered. Sadia kept the card, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder that people could change if they wanted to badly enough. Barbara had been cruel and dismissive when Sadia was vulnerable, but she'd apparently done enough self-examination to recognize her role in Gary's entitled worldview. Robert and Sadia bought a house together, something they'd designed together from the ground up with his architectural expertise and her eye for beauty. The house had his library and her home office, spaces for his children to visit, and eventually for grandchildren to play. They filled it with furniture they'd chosen together and art from their travels. Laurent's Creative's 5th anniversary celebration was covered by major publications, articles praising Sadia's leadership and the company culture she'd fostered. Journalists wanted to know her secret for rapid success, and she told them the truth. She'd hired talented people, treated them well, and given them freedom to do excellent work. One interview asked about her first marriage and how the divorce had impacted her trajectory, and Sadia answered carefully. She talked about being underestimated and using that as motivation, about finding freedom in endings, even when they felt devastating. She didn't mention Gary by name or describe his cruelty in detail. The article quoted her saying, "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. But only if you refuse to let it define your ceiling instead of just clearing your foundation." The quote went viral in business circles. Gary reached out through a mutual acquaintance, asking if Sadia would be willing to meet for coffee, claiming he wanted closure and the chance to apologize properly. Sadia declined through the same intermediary, explaining that she'd already found closure and didn't need his apologies to achieve peace. Robert supported her decision without trying to influence it either direction. He'd become her partner in the truest sense, someone who trusted her judgment. Their marriage worked because neither of them needed the other to be less so, they could be more. Nina got engaged herself that year, and Sadia threw her the kind of celebration Nina had thrown for her. They'd been through wars together, and watching Nina find happiness felt like victory they shared. The biggest surprise came when Barbara called asking if she and Sadia could meet. Sadia agreed to lunch at a restaurant that was neutral territory, and she went without expectations. Barbara showed up looking genuinely humble. Ordering salad she barely touched while she talked about recognizing her mistakes. She explained that watching Gary's life fall apart had forced her to examine her own role in raising someone who thought he could discard people without consequences. "I taught him that he was special just for existing," Barbara said, and tears gleamed in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. "I never made him work for anything. When he threw you away, I cheered him on because I thought you were holding him back. I was wrong about everything." Sadia listened without interrupting. When Barbara finished, Sadia was quiet before responding with honesty that felt important, even if it wasn't kind. "I appreciate you recognizing that you hurt me," Sadia said. "But apologies don't erase harm, and I'm not interested in rebuilding a relationship with you. I've moved on from that part of my life, and revisiting it wouldn't serve either of us well. I hope you've learned from your mistakes, and I hope you treat future daughters-in-law better. But I need you to understand that I'm done with your family." Barbara nodded, like she'd expected that response, and something in her expression suggested she was relieved to have said what needed saying, even if it didn't result in forgiveness. They finished lunch with uncomfortable small talk before parting ways permanently. That evening she told Robert about the lunch while they cooked dinner together in their beautiful kitchen. When she finished, he kissed her forehead and said he was proud of her for protecting herself, even when being kind would have been easier. Gary's story continued without her involvement, his life stabilizing into something humble. Nina reported that he seemed genuinely different, less defensive and more reflective. Sadia hoped he'd become a better person because everyone deserved the chance to grow. But his transformation no longer impacted her emotional landscape. The greatest victory Sadia had achieved wasn't destroying Gary's agency or proving her worth to people who'd dismissed her. The greatest victory was building a life so beautiful that revenge became irrelevant, so fulfilling that Gary's opinion stopped mattering. Robert's library project won major architectural awards, and Sadia attended the ceremony, feeling proud to be married to someone who created beauty that served communities. He thanked her in his acceptance speech, called her his inspiration. Lawrence Creative announced plans to establish a foundation supporting women entrepreneurs recovering from business failures. Sadia seeded it with significant funding and recruited board members who understood that success stories often began with spectacular failures. Gary sent a donation to the foundation, modest but apparently sincere, with a note saying he hoped it helped women avoid making his mistakes. Sadia accepted the donation because refusing it would hurt the foundation's mission more than it would hurt Gary. Nina had her own wedding, and Sadia stood beside her, feeling grateful for friendships that survived transformation. They'd both found partners who valued them appropriately. Both built lives that reflected their worth. The final conversation between Sadia and Gary happened accidentally when they encountered each other at an industry conference. They stood in a hotel hallway with other attendees flowing around them, and for a moment, neither spoke. "You look happy," Gary finally said. "Really happy, not just performing happiness." "I am happy," Sadia confirmed. "I built a life I love with someone who loves me properly." Gary nodded slowly. "I was terrible to you. I don't know if I've said that clearly enough before, but I was cruel and dismissive, and I hurt you in ways that weren't necessary. I'm sorry for that." "I know you are," Sadia replied, and she meant it. "I hope you've learned from the experience. But Gary, I need you to understand that your apology doesn't change anything for me. I've moved on." "I know," Gary said quietly. "I'm not apologizing because I think it'll fix anything. I'm apologizing because you deserved better, and I should have been better. And I wanted you to know that I understand that now." They parted cordially, and Sadia walked away, feeling absolutely nothing except maybe distant relief that the conversation was finally over. Robert found her on the conference center terrace. She told him about encountering Gary, about the apology and the awkward closure, and Robert just held her tighter. That night in their hotel room, Sadia reflected on her journey from that birthday to this moment, where his apologies felt irrelevant to her happiness. She'd been destroyed and rebuilt herself, had been dismissed and proven her worth. She'd thanked Gary for the gift when he'd handed her those divorce papers, and she'd meant it even though she hadn't known why yet. The gift wasn't the divorce itself, but the freedom it granted her to stop making herself small. Aunt Helena had left her money, but Gary had left her something just as valuable. Proof that being underestimated was only permanent if you believed other people's assessments. Chapter 10. The Life She Deserved. 2 years after the wedding, Sadia stood in her Monaco villa watching Mediterranean sunrise paint the sky in colors that seemed impossible, yet appeared reliably every morning. Robert slept in their bed behind her, his breathing steady and peaceful, and she felt contentment settle around her shoulders. The empire she'd built continued growing across continents. Her marriage deepened into partnership that felt effortless, even when it required work. And her life had become something she'd stopped needing to prove to anyone except herself. Lorentz Creative had evolved beyond her daily management, operating with systems and leadership teams that freed her to focus on strategy. She'd promoted talented people who'd grown with the company. The foundation supporting women entrepreneurs had helped hundreds rebuild after failures or escape difficult circumstances. Nina visited Monaco regularly, bringing her husband and their joy at having found partnerships that worked properly. They'd drink wine on the terrace while their husbands played chess inside, and they'd marvel at how completely their lives had transformed. Gary's life had stabilized into something ordinary but apparently fulfilling, working for the non-profit and living modestly and reportedly dating someone who worked in education. Sadia heard updates occasionally, and she felt nothing receiving the information except maybe distant hope that he'd become someone capable of treating partners better. Barbara had stopped reaching out after their final lunch. Respecting boundaries Sadia had set, Nina reported seeing her occasionally at charity events, where Barbara volunteered with genuine commitment. The greatest gift of Sadia's journey wasn't the wealth or the company's success, or even the marriage to someone who valued her appropriately. The greatest gift was remembering she'd always been enough, that her worth had never actually been determined by Gary's assessment or diminished by his abandonment. Robert proposed they buy a place in London permanently. Sadia agreed because putting down roots in multiple places felt natural. They found a townhouse near the office with gardens Robert could redesign. The industry that had once dismissed Sadia now invited her to speak at major conferences, sought her perspective on trends, and published her opinions in prestigious journals. She accepted opportunities that aligned with her values. Robert's children had children, and suddenly Sadia found herself a step-grandmother to babies who didn't care about her past or accomplishments, just about whether she'd read them stories. She discovered she loved this role. Gary sent a final letter years after their divorce, handwritten and thoughtful, explaining that he'd completed therapy and done extensive work understanding his patterns. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just wanted her to know that destroying his agency had been the best thing that could have happened because it forced him to examine behaviors he'd never questioned. Sadia read the letter twice before filing it away in a drawer she rarely opened. She felt no satisfaction from his growth and no vindication from his acknowledgement, just distant hope. The most radical thing Sadia did wasn't continuing to punish Gary, but rather choosing to stop caring whether he understood what he'd lost. His comprehension was irrelevant to her happiness. Nina threw Sadia a party for her 45th birthday, surprised her with guests from every phase of her life and speeches about transformation. Robert stood beside her while people toasted her success and resilience. That night, standing in her garden surrounded by people she loved, Sadia thought about the woman who'd signed divorce papers with shaking hands and thanked her cruel husband for a gift she didn't understand yet. She wanted to tell that woman she'd been right to sign without fighting. Robert found her standing alone and kissed her softly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking about how grateful I am that Gary was stupid enough to throw me away," Sadia replied honestly. "If he'd been smart enough to value me properly, I'd still be making myself small in a marriage that suffocated me." "His loss was my gain," Robert said. "I get to spend my life with someone extraordinary." Sadia kissed him again and turned back to her party, to her life, to her future. She'd thanked Gary for the gift on her birthday, and she'd meant it even before understanding why. The gift was remembering she'd always been powerful, that her worth had never actually been tied to someone else's opinion. Gary had tried to discard her like she was worthless, and she'd responded by proving her value so thoroughly that his opinion became irrelevant. Champions didn't waste time looking back at ruins of battles already won, Aunt Helena used to say. Gary was ruins she'd walked away from after winning, and she was too busy living spectacularly to remember the small man who'd once tried to make her feel small too. The end.